What could possibly make the most feared warriors of medieval Europe hesitate with unease? What hidden force could cause hardened Norse raidersmen who plunder coastlines from Ireland to Constantinople to whisper nervously by firelight? The answer lies deep in the frozen northern wilderness, in a chapter of Viking history largely forgotten. Vikings are often portrayed as the ultimate predators of the early medieval world. Their long ships brought terror to coastal communities across Europe. Their battle skill was unmatched, and their conquests reshaped entire political systems. Yet, as with all history, the truth is far more nuanced. In the vast, snow-covered forests and remote tundra of the far north lived a people so mysterious, so well adapted to their brutal surroundings, that even the Vikings feared them. This group didn't just resist Viking expansion, they instilled fear in those who were otherwise feared. They were known as the Bohemians, inhabitants of the far northern reaches of present-day Finland, northwestern Russia, and the Kola Peninsula. Unlike the seafaring Norse, the Bohemians were skilled in navigating the deep forests and frozen plains territory the Vikings called Bæmen in their sagas. This land existed at the edge of the known world, a place the Norse often associated with mythical giants and spirits. But the Bohemians were not legends. They were real, and the threat they posed was undeniable. "Beware the Watchers in the White Forest," warns a runic inscription discovered near Trondheim. They see without being seen. They strike without warning. They are not men as we know men. Dated around 950 CE, this message offers rare insight into the deep psychological effect the Bohemians had on their Norse neighbors. It points to a fear that contrasted sharply with the Viking image of fearlessness, one that would shape Norse expansion and trade routes for generations. The Bohemians' resistance wasn't just a military conflict, it reflected a broader clash of cultures, survival strategies, and belief systems. It demonstrates how a smaller, isolated community could effectively hold its ground against one of history's most aggressive expansionist forces. More importantly, it challenges the idea that history can be cleanly divided in the victors and the defeated. Even the most formidable warriors could be humbled when they strayed into unfamiliar terrain. This is the overlooked story of the people who instilled fear in the Vikings. To understand the unique threat posed by the Bohemians, we must first explore the Viking world, a time marked by exploration, conquest, and resource extraction, spanning roughly 793 to 1066 CE. This period began with the well-known raid on Lindisfarne Monastery and expanded into an intricate web of commerce, colonization, and warfare, stretching from North America to the Middle East. Though known for their raids, Vikings were more than just warriors. They were also farmers, merchants, and explorers who developed networks covering thousands of miles. Their ships' cutting-edge technology of their day enabled them to travel easily across seas and rivers, penetrating deep inland. In Viking society, honor and personal reputation were as important as wealth, and martial ability was highly prized. By the 9th century, Viking expansion was reaching its height. Norse settlers had established communities in Ireland, England, Scotland, and the North Atlantic. Rurik and his followers laid the foundation for the Kievan Rus in what is now Russia and Ukraine. Danish forces menaced Paris, while Swedish traders reached as far as Baghdad and Constantinople. But not all regions fell under Norse control. Some areas resisted due to their geography, climate, or strong local opposition. The thick forests and wetlands of what would later become Finland and northwestern Russia marked such a boundary. "The land of Bæmen lies beyond Finnmark," wrote Adam of Bremen in the 11th century, describing it as a land of unending snow and strange practices unfamiliar to Christians. His description hints at both the isolation and cultural uniqueness of Bohemian territory, a place where typical Viking strengths such as naval mobility, farming knowledge, and battlefield tactics held little sway. The Bohemians remained somewhat elusive in historical records. They were likely related to the Sami and Finnic peoples of northern Scandinavia and the Kola Peninsula, though they maintained distinct traditions and social structures. Archaeological evidence suggests they lived a semi-nomadic lifestyle centered on seasonal hunting, fishing, and trade. Unlike the hierarchical Norse society, the Byamians appear to have had a more egalitarian social order, where leadership was based on wisdom, skills, and spiritual authority rather than bloodlines or combat strength. What made the Viking Byamian encounters especially significant was the reversal of the usual power dynamic. Across Europe, Vikings relied on surprise, mobility, and fear to overcome even more organized foes. But in the far north, they were out of their element, unfamiliar with the terrain and climate, and at a distinct disadvantage against the people who knew the land intimately. So, what made the Byamians such effective opponents? How did they turn their hostile environment into a weapon against Norse incursions? Imagine the intense quiet of a snow-covered forest in midwinter. The way snow muffles sound yet makes distant noises echo. The limited visibility that comes with each snowfall. The biting air that seems to freeze in your lungs. Now imagine you're a Viking, used to the relatively mild shores of Norway or Denmark, stepping into this foreign, deadly silence. The Byamians' greatest asset was their deep knowledge of their harsh environment. Archaeological findings from 9th and 10th century settlements reveal sophisticated adaptations for surviving extreme cold. While Vikings often stay close to home during winter, Byamians remain active and mobile. They move like shadows over snow, wrote Arab traveler Ibrahim ibn Ahmed in 920 CE, who visited northern markets with Norse traders. Their feet are bound with strange gear that keeps them from sinking. Their sleds glide where our horses would collapse. These strange gear were skis and snowshoes, tools honed over centuries. Although Norse people may have known of them, the Byamians used them with practiced skill. Skis from the time vary in design, some optimized for speed across open plains, others for quick movement in dense woods. Byamian superiority wasn't limited to transport. Their multi-layered clothing made from fur, leather, and plant fibers offered far better insulation than the Vikings' wool. Studies of preserved garments show they used specific furs for different conditions. Reindeer for frigid weather, seal skin for damp environments, fox and marten for lighter warmth. Their shelters were equally impressive, ranging from semi-permanent, partly underground lodges to quickly constructed mobile huts. This flexibility allowed Byamians to access seasonal resources across large areas while staying ahead of would-be attackers. But their real genius was in weaponizing their environment. To the unprepared, the cold was deadly. For the Byamians, it was a constant companion. What slowed Viking raiders, the snow, the storms, the dense forest, became tools of concealment and mobility. Consider a tale from the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, describing a failed Viking expedition into Byman around 995 CE. Thoria led 30 men through the White Woods, searching for a Byamian trade site. For 3 days, they saw no one, but sensed they were being watched. On the 4th morning, their sentries were found dead, throats silently slit, and strange tracks surrounded their camp. Thoria ordered a retreat. Only 11 returned to their ships. This episode reveals something crucial: the Byamians' ability to track and ambush unseen. This flipped the usual Viking advantage. The raiders, once the predators from the sea, became the prey in the forest. But environmental mastery alone cannot fully explain the Byamian success in resisting Viking incursions. Their effectiveness also stemmed from a distinctive form of warfare, one that completely upended the Norse martial tradition and left seasoned warriors feeling confused and afraid. What happens when the most feared fighters of an era face an opponent who refuses to fight by familiar rules? What becomes of strength and skill when no open battle ever occurs, only a relentless, disorienting pursuit where attacker and targets switch roles constantly? The Vikings built their fearsome reputation on a very specific combat style: fast, aggressive, and psychologically overwhelming. They favored forming shield walls for defense or charging individually to gain glory and reputation. Their battles were often short but brutal, resolved by strength, courage, or tactical superiority. The Byamians dismissed this entire model. "They do not fight as men fight," wrote Byzantine diplomat Constantine Zuckerman after speaking with Norse traders in Constantinople around 950 CE. "They appear from nowhere, strike like lightning and vanish like mist. They leave no prints in snow that should reveal even a crawling child. Some believe they could change into animals, like wolves or bears, likely exaggerations. But the fact remained, they had turned the natural world into a more dangerous weapon than any blade. Archaeological findings support this depiction of unconventional warfare. Unlike Viking graves, often rich with swords, axes, and shields, Bahamian burial sites contain different tools. Lightweight hunting bows optimized for precision over power, narrow spears designed for quiet kills rather than thrusting in battle, and distinctively curved knives ideal for silent attacks. Bahamian combat tactics seem to have been shaped around 5 main principles that directly countered Viking strengths. First, a strict avoidance of direct confrontation. The Bahamians understood that they were unlikely to win in a straight-up fight against larger, better-armored Norse warriors. Instead, they practiced what today would be called asymmetric warfare, engaging only under conditions of overwhelming advantage, often through ambush or nighttime raids. Second, skilled use of their environment. They turned the landscape itself into both weapon and defense, carving hidden paths through otherwise impassable terrain, building disguised pits along common Viking routes, and perfecting the art of moving across frozen lakes and rivers that would collapse under Norse weight. Third, psychological manipulation. The Bahamians knew that fear could be more disabling than wounds. They deliberately fostered an image of otherworldliness, leaving strange carvings on trees, arranging bones in eerie patterns, and placing fallen Vikings in ritualistic poses. Did the Bahamians truly have supernatural powers, as many Norse came to believe? Or were they simply skilled at playing on Viking superstitions? Consider the account from the saga of Halfdan the Black, describing a conflict around 870 CE. The Bahamians moved silently, even across fresh snow. They could eliminate a sentry and vanish before the blood had cooled. When chased, they would run toward cliffs only to disappear, as though the rocks had swallowed them. Halfdan's men began to suspect they weren't fighting humans at all, and fear quickly spread. Most likely, these so-called supernatural feats were rooted in exceptional skill and deliberate trickery. They developed footwear that spread body weight evenly to prevent breaking snow crusts. They wore white furs that made them nearly invisible in winter. They built hidden shelters and escape routes throughout their lands, creating the illusion they could appear and vanish at will. Fourth, precision targeting. While Vikings often sought honor through open battle, Bahamian fighters emphasized efficiency. They focused on eliminating key individuals, leaders, scouts, and guards whose deaths would cause maximum confusion with minimum risk. One mass grave near the White Sea, dated to around 925 CE, held 15 Viking warriors. Forensic analysis revealed that 12 of them were killed by nearly identical wounds, a small blade inserted at the base of the skull or between upper vertebrae, suggesting trained fighters aiming for swift, silent kills. Fifth, strategic withdrawal. The Bahamians recognized that their strength came from their agility and ability to disappear. They rarely attempted to defend fixed positions, instead striking quickly and then falling back to prepared hideouts or blending into the terrain, making pursuit nearly impossible. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their fighting style was how it was passed down. While Vikings celebrated warriors in public rituals and trained young men through open apprenticeship, the Bahamians appeared to have used secretive hunting groups that raised specialized fighters from early childhood. The forest people choose certain children before they can walk, claimed an unnamed source in the Chronicle of Nograd around 1070 CE. They are raised to move without sound, to endure cold that would kill most men, and to strike without mercy. These children, the source claimed, became something between man and beast, terrifying all who faced them. Though this description may be exaggerated, it suggests a structured, focused approach to preparing elite fighters, something akin to early special forces. Excavations of Bahamian sites include areas believed to be training grounds where young people practice moving silently and shooting accurately from various positions. These ghost warriors proved so effective that they directly influenced Viking behavior in the north. Norse sagas record multiple cases where even experienced warriors refused to enter Bahamian territory, regardless of the potential rewards. In some cases, local leaders had to offer 3 times the usual share of loot just to convince warriors to join expeditions, and even then, many deserted. But Bahamian resistance went far beyond tactics. Their culture, belief systems, and social norms all seemed designed to disrupt the Norse understanding of the world. This created a mental barrier that worked as effectively as any wall or weapon. Spirits and sorcery, the psychological war. Have you ever felt that strange sensation of being watched while alone in the woods? That prickling tension along your skin, the quickening of your breath? Now imagine feeling that way for days on end, moving through unfamiliar terrain where every tree might conceal danger. This was the psychological state of Vikings who entered Bahamian territory, a constant alertness that slowly drained their morale and judgment. The psychological dimension of the conflict may have mattered more than any physical fight. The Bahamians seemed to intuitively understand what modern strategists call psychological operations using fear, uncertainty, and cultural confusion to destabilize an enemy. "The men speak of eyes in the dark," wrote Thorbjorn Horncloffe, a poet at the court of Harald Fairhair around 900 CE. "They feel watched by the forest folk, even when no one can be seen." Some claim they hear whispers in unknown tongues carried by wind that should be silent. Even the bravest grow afraid after 7 nights in that cursed land. This mental warfare functioned on multiple levels. The first was pure disorientation. Vikings were expert navigators by stars, coastlines, and landmarks. But in the trackless forests and flat winter landscapes of the far north, those markers disappeared. And the Bahamians made it worse. Evidence suggests that the Bahamians intentionally misled Viking explorers, creating false trails that led them in circles or into natural traps. They altered or removed key landmarks, making orientation nearly impossible. They even learned to hide their own tracks while crafting fake ones to mislead Norse pursuit parties. But environmental adaptation alone doesn't fully account for the Bahamians' ability to withstand Viking incursions. Their success was also rooted in a distinctive spiritual tradition, complex form of shamanism that appeared entirely alien and deeply unsettling to the Norse. While the Vikings accepted the existence of magic and the supernatural, their religious worldview operated within a relatively structured cosmology. Norse shamanic practices, such as cider, did exist but were often met with ambivalence and limited to specific ritual contexts. In contrast, Bahamian spirituality was more fluid, embedded in daily life, and integrated into every aspect of their society. To Viking observers, this spiritual worldview was both incomprehensible and deeply disturbing. Their sorcerers do not merely speak with spirits, but become them, reported Thangbrand, a Christian missionary who encountered the Bahamians around 997 CE. He described them wearing masks made of bark and bone to transform into animals and birds, and consuming potions that sent their souls into altered states, while their bodies lay motionless, as if lifeless. Most alarming to him was their treatment of the dead, not buried or cremated, but preserved in a state between life and death. This refers to the Bahamian practice of mummification, which has been thoroughly documented in archaeological excavations. Unlike the Norse, who typically buried or cremated their dead with grave goods, the Bahamians preserved the bodies of important individuals. Using smoke, cold, and plant-based resins, they dried and wrapped these bodies in birch bark and animal hides. These mummified ancestors were kept in sacred structures at the edges of settlements and served as spiritual advisors, consulted through ritual by shamanic leaders. To Norse visitors, the idea of living alongside preserved ancestors challenged their sense of natural order. Viking cosmology held strict boundaries between the worlds of the living and the dead. The Bahamians' visible, tangible dead with leathery skin, sunken eyes, and haunting expressions embodied a disturbing in-between state that suggested the usual rules of life and death did not apply in these lands. Perhaps the most unsettling part of Bahamian spirituality was their shamanic ritual practice. Archaeological finds include ceremonial drums, animal masks, and carved figurines depicting transformations between human and animal forms. These align with Norse saga descriptions of ceremonies occasionally witnessed, or more often overheard from a distance. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson recounts such an episode around 920 CE. They gathered around a great fire as night fell. It notes, the shaman wore a bear skull, complete with teeth and eye sockets, and a white fur cloak that seemed to glow in the firelight. He beat a painted drum made of stretched skin, and as the rhythm intensified, others began to twitch and convulse. Some dropped to the ground in seizures, while others howled like wolves and crawled around the fire. Egil's men, terrified, fled the scene convinced they had witnessed humans turning into animals. Modern anthropological analysis suggests these were trance-inducing ceremonies, common among circumpolar cultures. Participants likely entered altered states of consciousness using rhythmic movement, music, and possibly psychoactive substances from mushrooms or local plants. But to the Vikings, such acts represented a dangerous blurring of boundaries between man and beast, an unsettling violation of their cultural norms. While Norse mythology included occasional shapeshifters, like berserkers who took on bear-like traits, these were individual and limited phenomena. The Bahamians' elective, ritualistic transformation into animal forms was something far more disconcerting. Moreover, the Bahamians seem to have understood the psychological impact of their spiritual practices and used them deliberately to intimidate. Archaeological findings include so-called spirit posts, wooden carvings combining human and animal features placed along paths likely used by approaching Vikings. These acted both as territorial markers and as psychological deterrents, implying the presence of supernatural guardians. In some cases, the Bahamians appear to have staged elaborate spiritual scenes for Viking eyes. A fragment from the Halbach manuscript describes one such event. 3 nights into the forest, we found a clearing where none should exist. In its center stood a circle of antlers planted in the ground. Inside the ring lay 7 of our scouts, their eyes removed, yet the snow held no blood. Their weapons were sheathed, untouched. Wolf tracks led away in all directions, but no tracks led toward or away from the bodies. Thorfall, the Viking leader, immediately ordered retreat, declaring no prize worth the risk of confronting such sorcery. Modern interpretations suggest this was a carefully planned scene. The Bahamians likely ambushed the scouts, moved the bodies to a prepared clearing, and obscured their own tracks while fabricating wolf prints. The missing eyes reported in other accounts as well may have symbolized that the dead had seen forbidden things, or served to prevent their spirits from warning others. The cumulative psychological effect of such experiences became known in Norse sources as Bahamian dread, a distinct type of fear that afflicted even the most battle-hardened Viking warriors. It blended disorientation, perceived supernatural threat, and the unsettling feeling of being constantly watched. The saga of Harald Fairhair notes that men who had laughed in the shield wall at Ashdown, unshaken as arrows rained down, would flinch at every rustle in the Bahamian forest. Some awoke screaming from dreams in which the forest people visited them. Others refused to sleep or to take watch alone. When the Bahamians attacked on the 7th night, many of Harald's best warriors panicked, throwing down their weapons and fleeing blindly, never to be seen again. This psychological warfare explains how a relatively small and remote population could repel repeated Viking incursions. The cost of entering Bahamian lands was not measured only in casualties, but in the emotional toll on survivors. In this way, the Bahamians created a defensive buffer as effective as any wall or fortress. Yet the relationship between the Vikings and Bahamians was not purely hostile. Beneath the conflict, there existed another layer defined by trade, shared interests, and complex economic exchange. Despite the dangers, Norse merchants continued to seek out Bahamian goods. So, what could this harsh, remote land offer that was valuable enough to draw traders into such peril? The answer lies in the unique natural wealth of the region. From the land of Bahman comes wealth beyond measure, wrote Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who met Viking merchants in the Volga region around 922 CE. He described furs so fine that emperors and caliphs compete for them, ivory whiter and smoother than elephant. Tusk amber as clear as honey with trapped insects like preserved memories and other goods. Spoken of only in whispers, medicines, potions, talismans. Archaeological records support this account of a thriving northern luxury trade. The Bahamians controlled territories rich in high-value commodities, especially Arctic furs sometimes called soft gold. Pelts from animals like sable, marten, and Arctic fox were prized not only for warmth but for status, and fetched extraordinary prices from Constantinople to Baghdad. A single premium black fox pelt could sell for more than its weight in actual gold. Bahamians were highly skilled trappers, knowledgeable about animal behaviors, and capable of capturing them without damaging their coats. They also developed methods for preserving and transporting furs over long distances without loss of quality. In addition to furs, they exported other rare resources. Walrus ivory, sourced from the Arctic coast, was a preferred alternative to increasingly rare elephant ivory. Amber, collected along Baltic and White Sea shores, held both ornamental and medicinal value. Falcons captured in the region were considered the best in the world and were sold to nobles across Europe and the Islamic world. There were also more mysterious trade goods. Archaeological and written sources suggest the Bahamians gathered and processed certain plants, fungi, and animal derivatives believed to have medicinal or magical properties. These included chaga mushrooms, angelica root, and castoreum. This trade dynamic created ongoing tension between Vikings and Bahamians. On one hand, Norse merchants wanted access to these lucrative commodities and sought ways to control their movement into broader markets. On the other, direct access to the source Bahamian territory remained dangerous due to persistent resistance. As a result, Viking-Bahamian economic interaction took three general forms, each with distinct patterns of behavior and risk. Trading posts once stood at the borders between Viking and Bahamian territories. Settlements like the one excavated at Stiologa, near present-day St. Petersburg, reveal periods where the two cultures peacefully coexisted during seasonal markets. Trade occurred under mutually accepted conditions. In the month when ice begins to break, states the saga of Erver Odd, the Bahamians arrive at the Great Lake with 20 sleds full of furs and ivory. They set camp on the eastern shore and trade peacefully for 9 days. During this time, their shamans and Viking priests declared a sacred truce, no weapons drawn, no violence permitted. Any breach was treated as an offense to the gods. This spiritual framework for trade is supported by archaeological findings. Many frontier trading sites include ritual structures suggesting both sides took part in ceremonies to ensure peace. These likely included oaths, offerings, and invocations of protective spirits. The second form of trade was indirect, conducted through intermediaries. Many Viking traders avoided entering Bahamian territory and instead relied on third-party groups, often of mixed ancestry or smaller tribes, who had stable relations with both sides. The Karelians bring Bahamian goods to the winter market at Aldikiborg, recounts a Norwegian merchant in a text from around 950 CE. They insist on pure silver and scrutinize every coin. When asked about their source, they claim the Bahamians would kill anyone revealing the locations of their traps. This system allowed access to valuable goods while minimizing danger. However, it came at a cost, higher prices, and limited control over the supply chain. For Norse traders used to direct negotiation, this was a continual source of frustration. The third and most aggressive method was trade raiding. These Viking expeditions bypassed intermediaries in an attempt to seize goods by force targeting either source regions or storage depots. The best-known example is found in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, which describes a campaign in 995 CE. Olaf sailed 3 ships into the White Sea in search of the fabled Bahamian treasure mound, a stockpile of ivory and furs guarded by sacred idols. Guided by Thoria, a man of mixed heritage, they reached a mound as tall as 2 men. Inside, protected by carved figures, lay the wealth of many seasons. This account is partially corroborated by archaeology. A storage site from the late 10th century, discovered near the White Sea, contained remains of a wooden structure with signs of Norse assault arrowheads embedded in its beams and human remains with wounds matching Viking weapons. However, what made this raid notable was what followed. According to the saga, Ola's men filled 12 chests with loot and set out before dawn. By midday, strange sounds echoed through the forest. That evening, unseen archers had claimed 6 lives. By the third day, Bahamians attacked from the shadows, disappearing before the Vikings could retaliate. Only one ship returned to Norway, with just 8 survivors, men who spoke of horrors they could not explain. This pattern repeated across the Viking Age. Initial success often gave way to punishing retaliation. Over time, Norse leaders recognized that the risks outweighed the benefits. Even unfavorable trade terms became more acceptable than the cost of failed raids. This economic interplay reveals a striking contrast to typical narratives of Norse superiority. Despite their military strength and expansive trade network, the Vikings never succeeded in dominating the northern supply lines. The Bahamians, through skilled resistance and environmental control, maintained their economic independence throughout the era. Understanding this dynamic adds important context to the broader conflict. Viking expansion wasn't only about exploration or conquest. It was a strategic effort to gain control of valuable resources and trade routes. For the Bahamians, defending their homeland also meant safeguarding their role as gatekeepers to goods that were coveted throughout the medieval world. Yet this interaction wasn't purely economic or combative. Trade required communication, and communication required some cultural exchange. Through this contact, whether peaceful or confrontational, each side was influenced by the other in unexpected ways. One of the most significant cultural clashes centered around gender roles. What happens when a patriarchal warrior society encounters a culture where women hold both spiritual and political power? How do male fighters respond when their counterparts include women who command both authority and fear? This issue deeply unsettled Viking observers. Most shocking of all, wrote Adam of Bremen in his 11th century chronicle, is that among the Bahamians, women may become shamans and chieftains with power equal to or greater than men. They divine by means too profane to describe and lead war parties against intruders. Norse traders speak of archers whose arrows never miss, and priestesses who summon storms to destroy ships. Archaeological data supports these reports. Unlike Viking graves, which typically reflect rigid gender roles, Bahamian burials often include tools and symbols of power regardless of gender. Women were buried with hunting equipment, spiritual items, and indicators of leadership, suggesting these roles weren't restricted by sex as they were in Norse society. One notable burial near Lake Henniga contained a woman in her 40s laid to rest with a ceremonial drum, a carved staff, and a finely crafted bow. Another grave near the White Sea held a woman buried with a ritual knife, silver items of both Norse and Bahamian origin, and a set of divination tools, including carved stones and animal bones. These findings align with Norse saga accounts describing witch women and shield maidens among the Bahamians, women who wielded both spiritual and military power. Though such accounts must be viewed with caution, given their cultural biases, their recurring presence suggests they reflect real experiences. One example from the saga of Urvar Odd tells of a female war leader, the band that ambushed Thor. As men was led by a tall woman with hair white as snow, but a youthful face. She carried a bow of horn and bone and wore a cloak marked with symbols too painful to look at. When she raised her hand, her warriors attacked in silence. When she lowered it, they vanished like mist. Thorir himself she killed with a single arrow through the eye, despite his protection by 2 shield bearers. Such depictions directly challenged Viking gender norms. Norse women did enjoy certain rights uncommon in medieval Europe, such as property ownership, divorce, and some legal autonomy, but key roles in warfare, politics, and religion were typically male domains, except for limited spiritual practices like cider. Encounters with powerful Bahamian women forced Viking men to confront roles that defied their expectations. These were not women acting on behalf of male relatives. They held their own power, earned through skill, spiritual authority, and leadership. This system allowed access to valuable goods while minimizing danger. However, it came at a cost, higher prices, and limited control over the supply chain. For Norse traders used to direct negotiation, this was a continual source of frustration. The third and most aggressive method was trade raiding. These Viking expeditions bypassed intermediaries in an attempt to seize goods by force targeting either source regions or storage depots. The best-known example is found in the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, which describes a campaign in 995 CE. Olaf sailed 3 ships into the White Sea in search of the fabled Bohemian treasure mound, a stockpile of ivory and furs guarded by sacred idols. Guided by Thoria, a man of mixed heritage, they reached a mound as tall as 2 men. Inside, protected by carved figures, lay the wealth of many seasons. This account is partially corroborated by archaeology. A storage site from the late 10th century, discovered near the White Sea, contained remains of a wooden structure with signs of Norse assault arrowheads embedded in its beams and human remains with wounds matching Viking weapons. However, what made this raid notable was what followed. According to the saga, Olaf's men filled 12 chests with loot and set out before dawn. By midday, strange sounds echoed through the forest. That evening, unseen archers had claimed 6 lives. By the 3rd day, Bohemians attacked from the shadows, disappearing before the Vikings could retaliate. Only 1 ship returned to Norway, with just 8 survivors, men who spoke of horrors they could not explain. This pattern repeated across the Viking Age. Initial success often gave way to punishing retaliation. Over time, Norse leaders recognized that the risks outweighed the benefits. Even unfavorable trade terms became more acceptable than the cost of failed raids. This economic interplay reveals a striking contrast to typical narratives of Norse superiority. Despite their military strength and expansive trade network, the Vikings never succeeded in dominating the northern supply lines. The Bohemians, through skilled resistance and environmental control, maintained their economic independence throughout the era. Understanding this dynamic adds important context to the broader conflict. Viking expansion wasn't only about exploration or conquest, it was a strategic effort to gain control of valuable resources and trade routes. For the Bohemians, defending their homeland also meant safeguarding their role as gatekeepers to goods that were coveted throughout the medieval world. Yet this interaction wasn't purely economic or combative. Trade required communication, and communication required some cultural exchange. Through this contact, whether peaceful or confrontational, each side was influenced by the other in unexpected ways. One of the most significant cultural clashes centered around gender roles. What happens when a patriarchal warrior society encounters a culture where women hold both spiritual and political power? How do male fighters respond when their counterparts include women who command both authority and fear? This issue deeply unsettled Viking observers. Most shocking of all, wrote Adam of Bremen in his 11th century chronicle, is that among the Bohemians, women may become shamans and chieftains with power equal to or greater than men. They divine by means too profane to describe and lead war parties against intruders. Norse traders speak of archers whose arrows never miss, and priestesses who summon storms to destroy ships. Archaeological data supports these reports. Unlike Viking graves, which typically reflect rigid gender roles, Bohemian burials often include tools and symbols of power regardless of gender. Women were buried with hunting equipment, spiritual items, and indicators of leadership, suggesting these roles weren't restricted by sex as they were in Norse society. One notable burial near Lake Henniga contained a woman in her 40s laid to rest with a ceremonial drum, a carved staff, and a finely crafted bow. Another grave near the White Sea held a woman buried with a ritual knife, silver items of both Norse and Bohemian origin, and a set of divination tools, including carved stones and animal bones. These findings align with Norse saga accounts describing witch women and shield maidens among the Bohemians, women who wielded both spiritual and military power. Though such accounts must be viewed with caution, given their cultural biases. Their recurring presence suggests they reflect real experiences. One example from the saga of Odd tells of a female war leader. The band that ambushed Thor's men was led by a tall woman with hair white as snow but a youthful face. She carried a bow of horn and bone and wore a cloak marked with symbols too painful to look at. When she raised her hand, her warriors attacked in silence. When she lowered it, they vanished like mist. Thor himself she killed with a single arrow through the eye, despite his protection by 2 shield-bearers. Such depictions directly challenged Viking gender norms. Norse women did enjoy certain rights uncommon in medieval Europe, such as property ownership, divorce, and some legal autonomy, but key roles in warfare, politics, and religion were typically male domains, except for limited spiritual practices like cider. Encounters with powerful Bahamian women forced Viking men to confront roles that defied their expectations. These were not women acting on behalf of male relatives. They held their own power, earned through skill, spiritual authority, and leadership. This expedition marked a major escalation. Prior Viking missions to the region rarely involved more than 3 ships or 100 men. Olaf's fleet and army signaled a shift from raiding to deliberate conquest. In late spring 1026 CE, the fleet sailed around the Kola Peninsula and into the White Sea. At first, progress was swift. Several small fishing villages were found abandoned, likely due to advance warnings from Bahamian scouts. Olaf established a base near the mouth of the northern Dina River, launching probing raids into nearby areas. For nearly 3 weeks, Olaf's forces met no resistance. They found empty homes with fires still burning and warm food on the tables, notes the saga. Olaf took this as a sign of victory and ordered Christian rites to be performed in the deserted settlements. Crosses were erected, rivers were blessed, and land was claimed in Christ's name. This phase reveals the Bahamian response to large-scale invasion, strategic withdrawal. Rather than confront superior numbers directly, they implemented a scorched earth policy evacuating populations, removing valuables, and denying the Norse any immediate spoils. Archaeological findings suggest this was not a chaotic retreat, but an organized withdrawal. Structures remain intact, but key resources have been removed, showing deliberate preparation. As summer advanced, Olaf pushed his army inland along river valleys that cut through the dense northern forest. Here, resistance began to emerge subtly at first, then more dangerously. Scouts began vanishing without a trace, says the saga. Men sent to gather water disappeared. At night, drumming sounds echoed through the trees, accompanied by chanting in unfamiliar languages. Figures were seen watching from the forest, but when attacked, only bark and leaves showed signs of impact. Though effective against smaller groups, this psychological warfare had less impact on Olaf's larger force. Framing these events as demonic interference, Olaf reinforced Christian devotion among his men. Holy water was sprinkled around camps, and daily prayers were led by priests. By midsummer, Olaf's army had advanced farther into Bahamian lands than any Norse force before. Following the Dina River upstream, they neared a place the saga calls the Sacred Lake, likely Lake Kinizero, identified through archaeological evidence as a ceremonial center. It was at this lake that the Bahamians enacted their final and most sophisticated strategy, one carefully prepared over several weeks. As Olaf's fleet rounded the bend in the river and approached the lake, they were about to confront the full extent of Bahamian resistance. At the lake's center stood an island where numerous structures could be seen, their roofs glinting as if covered in precious metals. Smoke rose from many hearths, and King Olaf felt confident they had found the main Bahamian settlement untouched and rich. What Olaf did not know was that this was a carefully constructed trap. Archaeological evidence from Lake Kinero shows remnants of temporary structures built as decoys facades that gave the illusion of a prosperous settlement from afar. The gleaming rooftops mentioned in the saga were likely birch bark or thin mica sheets that reflected sunlight to mimic valuable materials. According to the saga, Olaf ordered 10 ships to advance toward the island while 5 stayed in reserve. As the ships crossed open water, all seemed calm. The island remained peaceful, smoke still rising from the buildings. But once the first ships landed and men began disembarking, the ambush began. Archaeology confirms the Byzantines had prepared the area for a coordinated attack. Hidden positions along the shoreline, camouflaged with natural materials, allowed archers to strike the exposed Norse. More critically, they launched an incendiary assault. Burning arrows rained from the trees. The saga claims these were no ordinary arrows, but carried a substance that clung to both wood and flesh, burning persistently. Simultaneously, Byzantine fighters appeared from hidden doors in the buildings on the island, trapping the disembarking Vikings. Modern analysis suggests the burning substance resembled an early form of Greek fire, a mix of pine resin, animal fat, and sulfur that ignited on contact and burned even on water. Archaeologists have found ceramic containers and arrowheads designed for delivering incendiaries at the site. The Norse ships quickly caught fire, forcing many men to jump overboard, where they became easy targets for archers. Those who reached the island faced surprise attacks from fighters emerging from underground passages, known Byzantine tactic used at multiple locations. The saga states Olaf ordered the reserve ships to rescue those in the water, but as they approached, they too were struck. 3 ships burned and sank. 2 managed to recover survivors before retreating toward the river mouth. When Olaf gave the command to withdraw, they found the river behind them blocked. Archaeological evidence supports this detail. Trees had been felled across the river during the battle, creating a barrier that left the remaining Norse ships with only a narrow, vulnerable path of escape. As night fell, the surrounding forest came alive with torchlight. Hundreds of torches moved among the trees, revealing the true size of the Byzantine force gathered from across their territory. War drums beat continuously and shamans danced around large fires, invoking spiritual protection. Few of Olaf's men slept, anticipating what morning would bring. The term sleeping fires, used to describe this battle, refers to what followed. At dawn, a strange mist rose from the lake. At first, Olaf thought it was divine fog to cover their retreat, but as it approached, men began coughing, eyes watering. Some collapsed, gasping for breath. Others jumped into the lake for relief. Paleoecological and archaeological research offers an explanation. The lake's natural sulfur deposits were likely used by the Byzantines. By burning particular materials in controlled wind conditions, they generated a toxic cloud of sulfur dioxide that drifted across the water toward the Norse fleet. This use of chemical warfare, combined with continued physical attacks, was devastating. The saga reports that only 2 ships and fewer than 60 men escaped. Though Olaf survived, it notes he coughed blood for days and never fully recovered. The Battle of Sleeping Fires marked a turning point in Norse-Byzantine relations. After this event, no Norse king would attempt another full-scale military expedition into Byzantine territory. The psychological blow delivered not by a recognized empire like Byzantium or the Caliphate, but by a forest-dwelling people long considered primitive, was profound. A generation later, Icelandic chronicler Afterkin wrote that Norwegians spoke of the northern lands with fear. Mothers warned their children about Byzantine shamans who could steal a warrior's breath. And even mentioning trade missions to the region was enough to make experienced sailors cross themselves in silence. The battle marked the height of Byzantine defense. Coordinated resources, carefully constructed traps, and effective environmental tactics used against a better-equipped opponent. It was not just a tactical success, but a clear example of asymmetrical warfare achieving decisive victory. However, history seldom ends cleanly. As the medieval era unfolded, new political and economic forces emerged, changing the landscape for both cultures. These transformations would alter their centuries-old rivalry into something more nuanced. How do former adversaries adapt when external powers begin to reshape their world? How do long-standing hostilities change when mutual survival demands cooperation? The final chapter of Viking-Byzantine relations is not a dramatic conclusion, but a gradual transformation. The 12th and 13th centuries brought considerable shifts in Northern Europe, the rise of Christian kingdoms, the Hanseatic League's dominance in trade, and the expansion of Novgorod and other Rus principalities. These developments reshaped Viking and Byzantine interactions. Where once there had been raids and resistance, now there was cautious interdependence. The old ways are fading, wrote a Norwegian cleric around 1150 CE. Where once our forebears sailed north in dragon ships to plunder, we now send merchant cogs with silver and cloth to trade for furs. The forest people no longer ambush but meet us at market under the watch of their spirits and our Christian God. Some have even accepted baptism, though many still follow their old beliefs in private. Archaeology confirms this shift. Earlier trading posts that were heavily fortified and culturally distinct evolved into shared settlements. By the late 12th century, objects with Bahamian designs appear among Norse goods and vice versa. Churches began appearing in former Bahamian regions, often incorporating local spiritual symbols. Several factors drove this change. First, Scandinavia's Christianization reduced the religious dimension of conflict. Second, the emerging European market system brought trade under more formal controls, encouraging stability. Lastly, both cultures faced new external threats that made continued hostilities untenable. The Karelians and Fascians pressed from the west. The men of Novgorod advanced from the south, bearing crosses and swords, reads a fragmentary Bahamian text later preserved in Finnish. The Northmen, our old foes, now offer alliance. Their priests speak of one God. Our shamans invoke the spirits. Yet both agree we must stand together or fall alone. This pragmatic cooperation marked a major evolution in their relationship. Archaeological findings from the 12th and 13th centuries show fortifications along Bahamian southern borders likely built with Norse help, particularly where the Novgorod threat loomed largest. Despite these changes, both cultures faced irreversible decline. The Viking Age effectively ended by the mid-11th century. Norse societies had largely joined the broader European political order. Raiding and decentralized trade were replaced by centralized kingdoms and Christian governance. The Bahamians faced even greater disruption. Their semi-nomadic lifestyle, spiritual customs, and non-hierarchical society clashed with emerging state systems. Christian expansion saw their sacred places destroyed or converted. As trade became more regulated, they lost influence as independent suppliers. The final lines of the saga cut off in your text hint at the passing of an era as the forest matriarchs who once led their people are slowly forgotten in a world reshaped by faith, commerce, and centralized rule. Certainly, below is your professionally paraphrased script, adhering closely to the original structure. And length, simplifying sentence structure, reducing redundancy, and preserving all key arguments while maintaining a neutral but firm tone where required. A Hanseatic merchant noted in 1230 CE that Bahamian traders were arriving with fewer furs each year. One woman explained that her people now had to travel far to find sable and fox, animals that once thrived near their homes. The best hunting grounds now lay within territories controlled by Novgorod, where her hunters were sometimes killed as poachers on lands their ancestors had roamed freely for generations. This account reflects the growing environmental and territorial pressures restricting Bahamian traditional life. Archaeological evidence indicates a shift toward more settled and concentrated communities, likely a response to shrinking hunting areas and the need to adopt more defensive living arrangements as external states expanded. By the late 13th century, the distinct Bahamian identity was increasingly absorbed into neighboring groups or overtaken by expanding political entities. Some communities were incorporated into the Novgorod Republic, adopting Russian Orthodoxy while preserving parts of their heritage. Others moved westward, merging with Karelian and Sami populations. Some chose to move further north and east, seeking to preserve their autonomy in increasingly isolated areas. The last true Bahamians now live beyond the northern mountains, wrote a Russian Orthodox missionary in 1290 CE. They continue the old ways, honoring their dead, consulting spirits, and living as their ancestors did. But each year, there are fewer of them. The young leave for trade towns or accept baptism. Soon, none will remain who remember the ancient songs or know the hidden forest paths. Archaeology confirms this slow fading of Bahamian culture. Rather than disappearing suddenly, their material traditions gradually evolved, incorporating Russian, Karelian, and Sami influences while still retaining some unique traits. By the 14th century, clearly identifiable Bahamian sites had become rare, though their cultural impact remained visible in the hybrid societies that followed. The Vikings experienced their own transformation. The Norse seafarers who once spread fear across Europe evolved into established medieval kingdoms. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became part of the broader European political landscape, and their once distinctive culture was reshaped by continental influences. The Old Norse religion gave way to Christianity, though some folk beliefs endured in altered forms. My grandfather told stories of the Yarmian witch women who could summon storms and change into wolves, wrote a Norwegian merchant in 1340 CE. As a child, I feared these tales. Now, I trade regularly with the people of the North. They are Christians like us, though they follow unfamiliar customs and speak a strange language. It is hard to imagine they are the same people who once drove King Olaf's army into retreat. This account reveals how, over time, the once intense Viking-Bahamian conflict was largely forgotten. The memories faded into myth, with Bahamians often misidentified or merged with other northern peoples in Norse narratives. Their cultural distinctiveness and resistance methods gradually disappeared from common memory. Yet traces of this long-standing conflict and its eventual resolution remain. Archaeological findings and oral traditions continue to preserve aspects of Bahamian influence, visible in regional spiritual practices, artistic designs, and adaptations to the environment. Tactics once used to resist Viking advances later became part of the military traditions of other northern cultures. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking-Bahamian story offers an alternative to the common portrayal of Norse expansion. It shows that Viking dominance was not absolute or inevitable. Even at their peak, the Vikings encountered communities that resisted effectively through deep knowledge of their surroundings and innovative, asymmetric strategies. Historian Alina Quasmanen argues that the Bahamians' real legacy lies not in monuments or written records, but in their example of how a smaller culture can survive through strategic resistance. They never defeated the Vikings in open warfare or conquered Norse territories. Instead, they made conquest too costly to pursue, compelling accommodation rather than surrender. In doing so, they preserved their independence and cultural identity for generations in the face of one of history's most effective expansionist forces. This perspective is valuable for understanding similar dynamics in other historical contexts, where dominant powers met determined resistance from smaller communities. The Bahamians show that resisting a stronger opponent does not require matching them in force, but rather understanding and exploiting their vulnerabilities. As we conclude this examination of a forgotten people who once instilled fear in Viking hearts, we're left with a more complex and meaningful narrative than those of conquest alone. The Bahamians never sailed south to raid Norway or occupy Swedish lands. Their success was more subtle, but no less important, the sustained defense of their lands, lifeways, and values against overwhelming pressure. In the northern forest they called home, they built a space where even Vikings hesitated to go. Through mastery of their environment, psychological tactics, and defensive innovation, they turned seeming disadvantages into powerful tools of resistance. Their chapter in history is not just about survival, it is about adaptation, strategy, and cultural resilience. Though the Bahamians themselves may have faded into obscurity, their impact endures in regional culture, in historical memory, and in the reminder that resistance, even when quiet, can shape the future just as powerfully as conquest.